Have you ever felt guilty for not wanting visitors? Maybe your friends drop by unannounced, and instead of excitement, you feel a quiet discomfort deep inside. Or maybe you're the kind of person who gets anxious when you hear the doorbell, even if it's someone you care about. Here's the truth. Not liking visitors doesn't make you cold, unfriendly, or antisocial. In fact, according to psychology and the deep insights of Carl Jung, it often says something profound about your soul, your energy, and your inner world. So today, I want to explore with you what this really means. Why do some of us dislike visitors, and what does that reveal about our personality, our boundaries, and even our spiritual life? Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you might just discover that this trait you thought was strange or negative is actually a reflection of something deeper and more powerful within you. Main idea 1, personal energy and space. Let's start with something simple. Energy. We all have a limited amount of emotional and psychological energy each day. Think of it like a battery. Some people recharge that battery by being around others. They love visitors, they thrive on small talk, and they feel alive when the house is full of noise and movement. But for others, the opposite is true. Being around people, especially unexpected visitors, drains the battery faster. And instead of feeling energized, you feel tired, overwhelmed, or even slightly irritated afterward. Does this sound familiar? Carl Jung explained this difference through the concepts of introversion and extroversion. But let me simplify it. If you don't like visitors, it may be because your soul values inner energy conservation. Your personal space is sacred, and when that space is suddenly occupied, your inner world feels disturbed, like someone walking into a quiet temple without knocking. Example from everyday life. Think about it like this. Imagine you've just finished a long workday. You're finally home, sitting down with a cup of tea, maybe reading a book, or just enjoying silence. Suddenly, the doorbell rings. A friend has come over just to hang out. Even though you might love this person, your whole mood shifts. Why? Because your soul was preparing for rest, solitude, and self-reflection. When someone enters without invitation, it's like someone barging into a private conversation you were having with yourself. It's not about disliking people, it's about honoring your own rhythm. Main idea number 2, the archetype of the inner sanctuary. Jung often spoke about archetypes, universal patterns of human experience. One of those patterns is the idea of the inner sanctuary. Throughout history, humans have always created sacred spaces, temples, monasteries, gardens, or even just quiet rooms where the soul could recharge. In a way, your dislike for visitors is a modern reflection of that same archetype. Your home, your personal space, isn't just 4 walls. It's your inner sanctuary. It's where you process your thoughts, recharge your emotions, and connect with your deeper self. When visitors arrive, especially uninvited, it feels as if your temple has been disrupted. Now, let's compare this with different cultures. In some cultures, hospitality is considered a sacred duty. You must welcome guests at any time with food, warmth, and conversation. Refusing visitors might even be seen as rude or selfish. But here's the interesting part. In other traditions, like certain monastic or spiritual paths, solitude and retreat are equally sacred. Monks, mystics, and even philosophers often lived away from society, limiting visitors because they knew how much the soul needed silence. So if you don't like having visitors, maybe your soul leans toward that second path, the path of reflection, solitude, and inner exploration. Not because you hate people, but because your psyche craves depth over constant interaction. I'll be honest, I relate to this deeply. There are times when I feel completely drained after hosting someone, even if I had fun during the visit. It's like my soul has a recovery period. And for the longest time, I thought something was wrong with me. But as I learned more about Jung's psychology, I realized, no, this is just how some souls are wired. Our boundaries, our dislike of visitors aren't flaws, they're signals. They're messages from the unconscious saying, protect your energy, guard your inner sanctuary, honor your soul.
Now, let's go a little deeper. Sometimes when we dislike visitors, it's not just about energy, it's also about the shadow. Jung used the term shadow to describe the hidden parts of ourselves that we don't usually acknowledge. For example, you may tell yourself, I'm just not a people person. But underneath, the real reason you avoid visitors might be tied to something unspoken, fear of judgment, unresolved trauma, or even a deep need to control your environment. Think about it. Visitors bring unpredictability. They might ask questions you don't want to answer, they might stay longer than you expected, or they might disrupt the little routines that keep you grounded. Your dislike of visitors could be your psyche's way of protecting you from discomfort, but it could also be an opportunity to ask yourself, am I avoiding people because I'm honoring my soul? Or am I hiding from something I don't want to face? Example from everyday life. Imagine someone who had a critical upbringing where every guest meant pressure. Clean the house perfectly, behave perfectly, don't embarrass the family. For that person, visitors might unconsciously trigger stress and anxiety, even years later. So when they say, I don't like visitors, it's not just a preference, it's a reflection of old wounds resurfacing. This is where self-awareness becomes crucial. Because if your dislike of visitors is rooted in old pain, then healing that pain might free you from unnecessary tension. On the other hand, if your dislike is rooted in authentic self-care, then it's not a wound, it's wisdom. Main idea number 4. Solitude as a form of growth. Here's another perspective. What if your dislike of visitors is actually part of your soul's growth? Carl Jung believed that solitude wasn't just about being alone. It was about creating space for inner dialogue, for listening to the unconscious, for allowing the deeper parts of yourself to speak. Visitors, in this sense, can sometimes drown out that inner voice. Their presence fills the silence with chatter, and suddenly the sacred dialogue between you and your inner self is interrupted. I think that's why many highly creative or deeply introspective people guard their solitude so fiercely. Writers, artists, philosophers, so many of them lived with limited social interactions because their energy was devoted to inner exploration. So if you don't like visitors, maybe your soul is quietly telling you, your work is inward. Protect your silence, because within it lies your transformation. Analytical comparison, modern culture versus ancient wisdom. Now, let's compare this to how our modern culture views visitors. Today, we often measure social value by how busy or socially active someone is. We admire people who throw parties, host dinners, and are constantly surrounded by friends. Meanwhile, someone who dislikes visitors is labeled antisocial or strange. But ancient wisdom often said the opposite. In many traditions, silence was considered the highest form of wisdom. The hermits of the desert, the yogis of India, the philosophers of Greece, they often rejected constant visitors, not because they hated people, but because they valued the inner life more. So perhaps what modern culture sees as antisocial, older traditions recognized as a form of deep self-knowledge. Personal reflection or story. I'll share something personal here. There was a time when I constantly felt guilty for not inviting people over. I thought, maybe I'm boring, maybe I'm selfish. But the more I forced myself to host, the more drained I felt afterward. Eventually, I realized that guilt was just a cultural voice in my head. My soul was saying something different. You don't need a crowd to feel complete. You need space to think, to write, to breathe. That realization changed everything. Instead of forcing myself to accept visitors all the time, I learned to set boundaries. I learned that it's okay to say no. And surprisingly, once I honored that truth, the relationships I kept actually became deeper because I was no longer running on empty. Main idea number 5, visitors as mirrors of the soul. Here's one last thought before we move to the conclusion. Sometimes the reason we dislike visitors has less to do with them and more to do with us. Visitors act as mirrors. When someone enters your space, they reflect back your own insecurities, your own unfinished business, your own inner discomfort. That's why some people feel restless with guests. It's not the guest, it's the mirror they bring. So in a way, every time you avoid visitors, you're also avoiding a reflection of yourself. The question is, which reflections are you ready to face, and which ones do you need to gently say no to in order to protect your peace?
So what does it actually mean on a soul level when you say, I don't like having visitors? It could mean that your soul is asking for rest. It could mean that your soul values inner depth more than outer activity. It could mean that you're at a stage in life where reflection is more important than performance. Carl Jung often spoke about the different stages of life. In youth, we're naturally more social because we're building careers, forming relationships, and seeking our place in the world. But as we grow older, the soul begins to turn inward, craving wisdom instead of noise. So if you don't like visitors, maybe it's not a flaw. It's a sign of evolution. Your psyche is moving into a stage where silence and solitude are more nourishing than constant company. But here's the nuance. Just because solitude is valuable doesn't mean we should cut ourselves off completely. Too much isolation can turn into loneliness, and loneliness, over time, can hurt both mental and physical health. The key is balance. Ask yourself, am I protecting my peace or am I hiding from the world? For example, you might not enjoy surprise visitors who drain your energy, but you might feel deeply nourished by spending time with one or two close friends who truly understand you. This is where discernment comes in. It's not about rejecting all visitors, it's about choosing who gets access to your inner world. Not everyone deserves that access, and your dislike of visitors might simply be your soul's way of demanding better boundaries. Let's take a step back and look at this from a cultural lens. In highly individualistic societies, people often feel guilty for not being social enough because the culture equates popularity with value. But in many traditional or indigenous cultures, solitude was recognized as part of the human journey. For example, vision quests, pilgrimages, or periods of retreat were seen as essential steps for personal growth. People were expected to spend time alone to understand themselves and only then return to the community with wisdom to share. So maybe your dislike of visitors is actually more natural than modern society makes it seem. Maybe your soul is simply aligning with an ancient rhythm. Withdraw, reflect, and return only when you are ready. I'll be honest with you. I've always found it strange that society pressures us into constant socialization. Some of the most peaceful and transformative moments of my life happened when I was completely alone. No phone, no guests, no interruptions, just me and my thoughts. And you know what? In those moments, I didn't feel antisocial. I felt alive. I felt connected to something bigger than myself. So if you feel the same way, if you don't like visitors, it doesn't necessarily mean something is wrong with you. It might mean that your soul is simply wired to thrive in stillness, and that's a gift worth honoring. So what does disliking visitors say about your soul? It says you value energy. It says you crave authenticity over small talk. It says your inner world matters just as much, if not more, than the outer one. And most importantly, it says you are learning to listen to yourself. Remember this, not every closed door is a sign of rejection. Sometimes it's a sacred boundary that protects the most precious part of you, your soul. Now I want to hear from you. Do you often feel drained by visitors, or do you actually enjoy having people around? And more importantly, do you think your dislike of visitors is about protecting your peace, or is it about avoiding something deeper? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear your perspective.
And if this video gave you clarity, please hit that like button, share it with someone who needs to hear this, and don't forget to subscribe for more deep psychological insights inspired by Carl Jung. Because remember, sometimes the quietest truths are the ones that reveal the most about who we really are.